The coffee pot exploded against the linoleum floor, sending shards of glass scattering like broken promises across the tiles of Rosie's diner. The sound cracked through the afternoon air, silencing every conversation, freezing every fork mid-bite, stopping every heart in that small roadside establishment off Highway 58 in Bakersfield, California. Officer Derek Holloway stood at the counter, his baton still raised from where he had slammed it down with enough force to send that coffee pot flying. His face was twisted into something ugly, something that had been festering inside him for years, something that finally had permission to show itself in the presence of people he considered beneath him. "I don't serve animals in uniform," Holloway snarled, his eyes locked on the black man in the leather vest sitting 3 stools down, "and I sure as hell don't take orders from the Negro women who protect them." The words hung in the air like poison gas, seeping into every corner of that sunshine yellow diner, coating everything they touched with their venom. Rosie Jenkins stood behind the counter, her hands still positioned where they had been holding that coffee pot just seconds before, now holding nothing but air and disbelief. She was 67 years old. She had owned this diner for 30 years. She had survived poverty, widowhood, racism, and every attempt this world had made to break her spirit. But in that moment, on that scorching Tuesday afternoon in July 2000, Rosie Jenkins realized that everything she had built was about to either crumble into dust or transform into something she never could have imagined. But to understand what happened in that diner, to truly grasp the magnitude of what Rosie Jenkins did and what it set in motion, we need to go back to where this story truly begins. Rosie Jenkins opened her small roadside diner off Highway 58 in 1985, right after her husband Thomas died in a factory accident that changed everything. Thomas had worked at the Bakersfield manufacturing plant for 22 years, never missing a shift, never complaining about the long hours or the dangerous conditions. He believed in hard work. He believed that if you did your job right, if you showed up every day and gave your best, the world would treat you fairly in return. The world did not treat Thomas Jenkins fairly. The machine that killed him had been flagged for maintenance 6 times in the previous year. Every worker on that floor knew the equipment was faulty. They had filed reports, raised concerns, begged the supervisors to fix the problem before someone got hurt. But fixing the machine would have meant shutting down the line for 2 weeks, and shutting down the line would have cost the company money, and money mattered more than the life of a 50-year-old black man who was 3 years away from retirement. When the machine malfunctioned on March 15, 1985, it caught Thomas's arm and pulled him in before anyone could react. He died on the factory floor, surrounded by coworkers who loved him and supervisors who had ignored every warning that could have saved his life. The insurance company ruled it operator error. Rosie fought that ruling for 4 months. She hired a lawyer with money she didn't have. She gathered statements from Thomas's coworkers. She obtained maintenance records that proved the company had known about the danger. But the factory had better lawyers, deeper pockets, and connections to people who made sure that cases like Rosie's never saw the inside of a courtroom. The settlement barely covered the funeral. Rosie was 42 years old with 2 teenage daughters to feed, a mortgage payment due in 3 weeks, and a husband-shaped hole in her heart that would never fully heal. She had every reason to give up, to let the grief and the injustice swallow her whole, to become another casualty of a system designed to chew up people like her and spit out the bones. Instead, Rosie Jenkins took every penny of Thomas's life insurance money and bought a rundown building that most people drove past without a second glance. The building had been a gas station once, then a feed store, then nothing at all for 5 years. The windows were cracked. The roof leaked in 3 places. Rats had made themselves comfortable in the walls, and the previous owner had left behind enough trash to fill a dumpster twice over. Anyone with sense would have looked at that building and seen a money pit, a guaranteed failure, a foolish investment by a grieving widow who wasn't thinking straight. Rosie looked at that building and saw possibility. She scrubbed the floors herself, on her hands and knees, working from 6 in the morning until midnight for 3 straight weeks. She painted the walls sunshine yellow because Thomas had always said that yellow was the color of hope, the color of new beginnings, the color of stubborn optimism in the face of everything trying to dim your light. She learned basic plumbing from library books and fixed the pipes herself. She patched the roof with materials bought on credit and prayers that it wouldn't rain until she could afford proper repairs. And when the building was finally ready, Rosie hung a hand-carved wooden sign above the door. Thomas had started carving it as a surprise for their 25th anniversary, planning to give it to her when they finally saved enough money to open the restaurant they had always dreamed of running together. He had finished the carving just 2 weeks before he died, hiding it in the garage where Rosie found it when she was sorting through his things. The sign read, "Rosie's Place Where Everyone's Family." For 15 years, Rosie's Diner became a sanctuary on Highway 58. Truck drivers knew her chicken fried steak was the best within 200 miles and planned their routes around stopping at her counter. Local families claimed booths for Sunday breakfast like they were reserved church pews, passing down the tradition from grandparents to parents to children. Travelers who stumbled upon the diner by accident became regulars who drove out of their way just to experience the warmth that radiated from those sunshine yellow walls. But what made Rosie's place truly special wasn't the food, as good as it was. What made it special was who Rosie chose to see when others chose to look away. She hired ex-convicts trying to start fresh, men and women who had served their time and paid their debt to society only to find that society wasn't interested in letting them move forward. She gave them aprons and taught them the grill and treated them like the human beings they had never stopped being, even when the world insisted on seeing them as nothing more than their worst mistakes. She hired teenagers from broken homes, kids who had been written off by teachers and counselors and everyone else who was supposed to believe in them. She taught them responsibility and work ethic and the revolutionary concept that someone actually expected them to succeed. She hired immigrants struggling with English, people who had crossed oceans and borders and mountains of paperwork to build new lives in a country that often seemed determined to remind them they didn't belong. She learned enough Spanish and Vietnamese and Tagalog to make them feel welcome, and she celebrated their holidays alongside American ones until her diner became a place where cultures mixed and mingled and found common ground over plates of biscuits and gravy. Rosie had one rule, and she posted it behind the register where everyone could see it: respect given is respect earned. No exceptions. That rule applied to everyone who walked through her door. Rich or poor, black or white, stranger or regular. If you treated people with respect in Rosie's place, you received respect in return. If you didn't, you were invited to take your business elsewhere. Most people appreciated the simplicity of that arrangement. The ones who didn't learned quickly that Rosie Jenkins was not a woman who bluffed. That Tuesday in July 2000, Rosie was in the kitchen working on a batch of her famous peach cobbler when she heard the rumble. It started as a distant thunder, the kind of sound that made you look up at the sky to check for storm clouds. But the sky was clear that day, blazing blue and hot enough to fry an egg on the highway asphalt. The sound grew louder, closer, until the windows of the diner began to vibrate with the unmistakable roar of motorcycles. Rosie wiped her hands on her apron and pushed through the swinging door that separated the kitchen from the dining room. Through the front windows, she watched 12 Harley-Davidson motorcycles pull into her parking lot, their chrome glinting in the afternoon sun, their engines rumbling like a pride of lions announcing their arrival. The riders wore leather vests bearing a patch that Rosie recognized immediately from news reports and whispered warnings. The Winged Death's Head. The letters that struck fear into the hearts of people who had never actually met the men and women who wore them. Hell's Angels, Bakersfield chapter. The lead rider killed his engine and removed his helmet. He was a black man, perhaps in his late 50s, with gray threading through his beard and eyes that held the kind of depth you only see in people who have witnessed things that most folks only experience in nightmares. He swung his leg over the bike with the practiced ease of someone who had been riding longer than some of Rosie's employees had been alive. His name was Samuel Prophet Washington, though Rosie wouldn't learn that until later. Prophet walked toward the diner first, his boots crunching on the gravel, his crew falling into formation behind him. They were a mix of men and women, black, white, and Latino, all wearing the same colors, all moving with the quiet confidence of people who had nothing to prove and no interest in proving it anyway. The bell above the door chimed as Prophet stepped inside. Every eye in the diner turned toward him, toward the patches on his vest, toward the crew filing in behind him. Rosie watched her customers tense, watched them calculate the distance to the exits, watched fear flicker across faces that had never had a reason to fear anything inside these sunshine yellow walls. Prophet met Rosie's eyes across the counter. His voice, when he spoke, was surprisingly gentle, carrying none of the menace that his appearance might have suggested to those who judged books by their covers. "Ma'am," Prophet said, "we're just passing through. Looking for a meal and maybe some of that pie we heard about 3 counties over." Rosie had been serving people for 15 years. She had developed an instinct for trouble, a sixth sense that told her when someone walked through her door with bad intentions. That instinct was silent now. These people weren't here to cause problems. They were here because they were hungry, because they had heard about her pie, because Highway 58 was long and hot and a good meal was worth going out of your way for. Rosie smiled the same smile she gave everyone who entered her establishment. "Then you've come to the right place. Sit anywhere you like." The bikers settled into booths and along the counter with a politeness that bordered on ceremonial. They said "ma'am" and "please" and "thank you" in ways that would have impressed a Southern grandmother. They kept their voices at conversational levels. They didn't curse or swagger or do any of the things that movies and news reports suggested they should do. They just ordered food like regular people, because that's exactly what they were. Rosie's waitress Keisha was 17 years old and working her first real job. She had heard stories about the Hells Angels, the same stories everyone heard, and her hands shook visibly as she carried water glasses to the booth where Prophet sat with 3 other bikers. Water sloshed over the rim of one glass, splashing onto the table, and Keisha's face flushed with embarrassment and fear. Prophet caught her eye before she could apologize. His voice was warm, reassuring, carrying the tone of a grandfather calming a frightened grandchild. "It's all right, young sister. We're just hungry folks, same as anyone." Keisha's hand steadied. She took their orders with growing confidence, and by the time she returned with their food, she was chatting with them about the community college she hoped to attend in the fall. One of the women bikers, a Latina with silver streaks in her dark hair, gave Keisha advice about financial aid applications and told her not to let anyone convince her she wasn't college material. For 14 minutes, Rosie's place was exactly what it had always been. A sanctuary where everyone was family, where the color of your skin or the patches on your vest mattered less than the respect you showed to the people around you. For 14 minutes, the Hells Angels and the truck drivers and the local families all shared space in those sunshine yellow walls, proving that Rosie's vision of what the world could be wasn't naive but necessary. And then the door opened again. And everything changed. Officer Derek Holloway walked into Rosie's place like he owned it. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished to a mirror shine, and his hand rested on his belt with the casual arrogance of a man who had never faced consequences for anything he had done in his 23 years on the Bakersfield police force. Behind him, a younger officer named Mills stepped through the door with considerably less confidence. Mills was 26 years old, 3 years into a career he had chosen because he genuinely wanted to help people, and every day spent partnered with Derek Holloway was teaching him that the badge didn't always mean what he had hoped it would mean. The diner fell silent for the second time that afternoon, but this silence was different from the one that had greeted the bikers. This silence was heavier, more oppressive, carrying the weight of history and the sharp edge of present danger. Rosie's regular customers knew Derek Holloway. They knew his reputation. Derek Holloway was known in Bakersfield, but not for the reasons a police officer should be known. He was known for his routine traffic stops that always seemed to target black drivers. Vehicles with black occupants were 3 times more likely to be pulled over by Holloway than by any other officer on the force, a statistic that the department dismissed as coincidence every time it was raised. He was known for the complaints that disappeared into administrative black holes, filed by citizens who believed that their voices mattered, processed by supervisors who believed that protecting their own mattered more. He was known for the thin blue line tattoo on his forearm, which he displayed proudly, and for the Confederate flag sticker that had once adorned the bumper of his personal truck until the department received enough complaints to force him to remove it. He had removed it publicly, cursing the politically correct nonsense that was ruining America, and replaced it with a smaller one on the inside of his glove compartment where he could see it every day. He was known for the way he spoke to black citizens, for the casual cruelty of his tone, for the way he used the word boy when addressing grown men, and the way he made women feel small with nothing more than a look. He was known for the arrests that didn't quite add up, for the evidence that sometimes appeared in pockets that suspects swore had been empty, for the injuries sustained during arrests that were always ruled justified. He was known, and he was feared, and he had never once been held accountable for any of it. Holloway's eyes swept across the diner like a prison spotlight, cataloging faces, noting the bikers, lingering on the leather vests and the patches they bore. His gaze stopped on Prophet Washington, and something ugly flickered across his expression. A black man wearing Hells Angels colors. In his territory. Eating pie like he had every right to be there. "Well, well," Holloway announced, his voice pitched loud enough to ensure that everyone in the diner could hear him. "Looks like the criminal element is gathering. Must be my lucky day." Prophet didn't react. He continued eating his pie, his movements calm and deliberate, his eyes fixed on the plate in front of him. He had dealt with men like Holloway before. In Vietnam, where commanding officers had sent black soldiers on the most dangerous patrols. In Alabama, where police officers had beaten him during a civil rights march. In California, where he had spent decades building a brotherhood only to have law enforcement treat him like a criminal for wearing a patch. Prophet knew that reacting to men like Holloway only gave them ammunition. So he didn't react. He just kept eating his pie. "Prophet Washington," Holloway said, walking toward the counter where Prophet sat. "I'm gonna need to see some ID. You too." He gestured broadly at the other bikers. "All of you. I got reports of stolen motorcycles in the area." There were no reports. Every person in that diner knew there were no reports. Holloway didn't need reports. He needed only the power of his badge and the knowledge that no one in this room could stop him from doing whatever he wanted. Prophet reached slowly for his wallet, keeping his movements visible and non-threatening, his hands where Holloway could see them at all times. He had learned long ago that sudden movements around certain police officers could get a black man killed, and his survival instincts had never fully relaxed despite the decades that had passed since he first learned that lesson. "Officer," Prophet said, his voice steady and respectful, "we're just having lunch. Everything's legal and registered. Every bike in that lot has papers, and every person in here has a clean record." Holloway snatched the ID from Prophet's hand before Prophet had fully extended it. He glanced at it for perhaps half a second, not reading anything on it, not running it through any system, not doing any of the things an officer would actually do if he suspected criminal activity. Then he tossed it onto the counter like it was garbage. "I'll decide what's legal," Holloway said. The words hung in the air, a declaration of power that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with the belief that some people were above accountability. Mills shifted uncomfortably by the door, looking anywhere but at his partner, wishing he was somewhere else, knowing that speaking up would accomplish nothing except making himself a target. Prophet picked up his ID and returned it to his wallet. "We haven't broken any laws, officer. We're just customers having a meal." "You got warrants, Washington?" Holloway pressed forward, standing too close, invading Prophet's space in a calculated act of intimidation. "You carrying? Maybe I should pat you all down right here, make sure you're not bringing drugs into this fine establishment. What do you think about that?" Rosie pushed through the swinging door from the kitchen. She had been listening to the exchange, her blood pressure rising with every word Holloway spoke, her hands gripping the edge of the counter hard enough to turn her knuckles white. She was 67 years old. She had arthritis in her right hip that made standing for long shifts painful. She had high blood pressure that her doctor kept warning her about. She had a granddaughter starting college in 2 months on a scholarship that the family had scraped and sacrificed to supplement. She had every reason to stay quiet, to let this play out, to protect her business and her family from the retaliation that would surely come if she spoke up. Rosie stepped out from behind the counter and positioned herself between Holloway and the bikers. "Officer Holloway," she said, her voice calm but carrying the steel that 30 years of running her own business had forged, "these folks haven't caused any trouble. They've been polite, they've been respectful, and they're paying customers. Whatever you think you're doing here, it doesn't need to happen in my establishment." Holloway's head turned toward Rosie with the slow menace of a predator acknowledging new prey. His eyes narrowed, taking in this gray-haired black woman who had just stepped into the middle of his intimidation campaign. "You defending criminals now, Rosie?" Holloway's voice dripped with contempt. "That's interesting. Real interesting. I would have thought a business owner like yourself would appreciate law enforcement keeping an eye on the kind of people who might cause trouble in your neighborhood." "These people haven't caused any trouble," Rosie repeated. "The only trouble I've seen today walked in wearing a badge." The words landed like a slap. Mills inhaled sharply by the door. The bikers froze, watching the confrontation with the focused attention of people who understood exactly how dangerous this moment had become. Even Holloway seemed briefly stunned, unaccustomed to being challenged, especially by a black woman, especially in public, especially in front of witnesses. The stunned silence lasted only a moment. Then Holloway's face reddened, and his expression shifted from arrogance to fury. "You want to be careful here, Rosie," Holloway said, stepping toward her, closing the distance until he was standing close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "Real careful. Makes me wonder what else might be going on in this place. When's the last time the health inspector came through? When's the last time we checked your employee documentation? I bet if I made a few calls, I could find all kinds of problems that need attention." The threat was explicit. He was telling her, in front of a room full of witnesses, that he would destroy her business if she didn't back down. He would have inspectors swarming her kitchen by the end of the week. He would have immigration enforcement checking the papers of every employee. He would find violations where none existed, and he would bury her in fines and citations until she had no choice but to close her doors. Rosie looked into Derek Holloway's eyes and saw every injustice she had ever faced reflected back at her. She saw the insurance company that had called her husband's death operator error. She saw the lawyers who had told her she couldn't win. She saw every landlord who had refused to rent to her because of her skin color, every bank that had denied her loans, every person who had looked at her and seen nothing but an obstacle to be dismissed. She saw 30 years of building something beautiful, of creating a sanctuary in a world that tried to tear sanctuaries down, of proving every single day that decency and respect could flourish even in the hardest soil. And she refused to let this man take it from her through intimidation. "These people have done nothing wrong," Rosie said. "You have no cause to harass them." "No cause?" Holloway's voice rose to a near shout. "I got all the cause I need. These thugs. We're not thugs." Prophet's voice cut through Holloway's tirade, quiet but firm. He remained seated on his stool, his posture non-threatening, his hands visible on the counter. But something in his tone commanded attention, demanded acknowledgement. "We're veterans," Prophet said. "Most of us served. We did tours in places that would give you nightmares, officer. We earned our medals and we earned our scars, and we came home to a country that didn't always want to welcome us back. So we found our own family. We ride together. We watch out for each other. And we don't break laws." For a moment, something flickered across Holloway's face. It might have been doubt. It might have been the momentary recognition that the narrative he had constructed didn't match the reality in front of him. But whatever it was, it vanished quickly, replaced by an anger that had been building for years, an anger that couldn't tolerate being challenged by people he considered beneath him. "You calling me a liar?" Holloway's voice went cold and deadly. "That's it. Everybody up. Hands where I can see them. Now." He reached for Prophet, attempting to grab the older man's arm and yank him off the stool. Prophet, operating on instincts developed across decades of survival, pulled back slightly, a natural human reaction to someone grabbing at you unexpectedly. That small movement was all Holloway needed. His hand went to his belt. Not to his handcuffs. Not to his radio. To his gun. "Derek, N.O." Mills's shout cracked across the diner as the younger officer finally found his voice. But Mills was too far away, too shocked, too paralyzed by the sudden escalation to physically intervene. The gun was half-drawn from Holloway's holster when Rosie Jenkins made the decision that would change everything. She stepped directly between Officer Derek Holloway and Prophet Washington. She positioned her body as a shield, her arms slightly extended at her sides, her eyes locked onto Holloway's with an intensity that stopped him mid-motion. "You will not do this." Rosie's voice was steel wrapped in velvet, the voice of a woman who had survived things that would have broken weaker spirits, the voice of a grandmother who had buried a husband and raised daughters and built a business and endured every indignity this world had thrown at her without ever losing her fundamental belief that human beings should treat each other with decency. "Not in my establishment. Not to people who have done nothing wrong." The diner went completely silent. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioner and the distant rumble of a truck passing on Highway 58. Every eye was fixed on the confrontation at the counter. Every breath was held. Every heart had stopped beating, waiting to see what would happen next. Holloway's gun was half-drawn. His hand trembled slightly, from rage or uncertainty or both. He stared at Rosie Jenkins, this gray-haired woman who had just put her body between his weapon and his target, and for the first time in as long as anyone could remember, Derek Holloway seemed unsure of what to do. Behind the counter, Keisha had her phone out. The 17-year-old's hands were steady now, steadier than they had been all day, as she recorded everything that was happening. The camera captured Holloway's face, captured the half-drawn weapon, captured Rosie standing as a human shield between a police officer and an unarmed civilian. "These folks want to press charges for harassment," Rosie said, her voice cutting through the silence. "I'll testify. I'll tell anyone who asks exactly what I saw here today." "And that girl back there?" She nodded slightly toward Keisha without breaking eye contact with Holloway. "She's been recording since you walked in." Holloway's eyes darted to Keisha, to the phone pointed at him, to the evidence that was being created in real time. He looked back at Rosie, at the determination in her face, at the absolute refusal to back down that radiated from every inch of her being. For 3 terrible seconds, no one moved. The diner existed in a suspended moment where anything could happen, where violence trembled on the edge of manifestation, where the wrong word or the wrong movement could end in tragedy. Mills grabbed his partner's arm. "Derek," he said urgently, his voice pitched low but insistent. "We need to go. Now. This isn't worth it. Let's just go." Holloway's jaw worked, muscles tensing and releasing as he fought against the rage that demanded he finish what he had started. He wanted to arrest everyone in the building. He wanted to teach this old woman a lesson she would never forget. He wanted to remind these people who held the power in this town and what happened to those who forgot their place. But the phone was recording. And there were witnesses. And even Derek Holloway, who had escaped consequences for 23 years, could calculate the odds of surviving this particular encounter unscathed if he proceeded. He holstered his weapon. His face contorted into an expression of pure hatred, a mask of rage that promised retribution in ways that a camera couldn't capture and witnesses couldn't prevent. "You just made an enemy, Rosie." His voice was quiet now, controlled, more frightening in its restraint than it had been in its fury. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot. You think you won something here today? You didn't win anything. You just put yourself on my list. And everyone on my list eventually learns what a mistake that was." He turned and walked toward the door. Mills followed, his face pale, his eyes refusing to meet anyone else's gaze. Holloway paused at the threshold, his hand on the door frame, and turned back to deliver one final look at Rosie Jenkins. The look promised everything his words had implied. It promised inspections and citations and visits from every agency that could make her life difficult. It promised that every traffic stop, every interaction with law enforcement, every moment of her life that touched the systems he could influence would become an exercise in harassment. "Get out of my diner," Rosie said quietly. Holloway left. The door swung shut behind him. Through the windows, everyone watched as the two officers got into their patrol car and pulled away, heading east on Highway 58 until the vehicle disappeared from view. The moment the car was gone, the diner erupted. People were talking, shouting, crying, hugging. Someone was calling for napkins because they had spilled their water during the confrontation. Someone else was saying that they had never seen anything like that in their life. A truck driver who had been eating at the counter stood up and announced that his meal was on him, that Rosie shouldn't charge him a dime after what she had just done. Prophet Washington stood up from his stool and approached Rosie. The tears in his eyes startled her. This was a man whose face bore the lines of a hard life, whose hands showed the scars of battles both military and personal, whose reputation suggested someone who had long ago become immune to emotional displays. But Prophet was crying. Silent tears tracing paths through the gray of his beard, his eyes bright with something that looked like awe. "Ma'am," Prophet said, his voice rough with emotion, "do you understand what you just did? Do you understand what you risked?" Rosie's hands were shaking now. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation was fading, and in its place came the full weight of what had just happened, what could have happened, what might still happen as a result of her choice. "I understand that I'm tired," Rosie said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to control it. "Tired of watching good people get hurt for no reason except hate. Tired of seeing badges used as weapons instead of shields. Tired of pretending that it's not my problem when injustice happens to someone else, like somehow being quiet is the same as being safe." She looked at Prophet, at the tears on his face, at the bikers gathered behind him who were watching her with expressions that ranged from amazement to gratitude to fierce, protective anger. "My husband Thomas used to say that the only thing evil needs to win is for good people to look the other way," Rosie continued. "I've spent too many years looking the other way. Telling myself that keeping my head down was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. But there's no safety in silence. There's no wisdom in letting wrong go unchallenged just because challenging it is dangerous." She straightened her spine, even as her hands continued to shake. "So no, I don't fully understand what I risked. Maybe everything. Maybe this place, maybe my family's security, maybe my own freedom if Holloway finds a way to come after me. But I understand what I couldn't risk, which was letting that man hurt someone in front of me when I had the power to stop it." Prophet reached into his pocket and pulled out a cell phone. The bikers around him had gone quiet, watching their leader with the attention of people who knew that something significant was about to happen. "Hammer?" Prophet said into the phone. "Yeah, it's me. Listen, something just happened in Bakersfield. Something you need to hear about?" He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. "No, I'm fine. But there's a sister here who needs protection. A black woman, grandmother, owns a diner off Highway 58. She just stepped between me and a cop who had his gun half drawn. Shielded me with her own body. Told him to get out of her establishment." Another pause. "Yeah. You heard me right. She put herself between a racist cop and his target, knowing full well what it might cost her. Now she's got a target on her back, and we both know that cop isn't going to let this go." Prophet's voice hardened with purpose. "I need you to spread the word. All chapters. California, Nevada, Arizona. Every brother and sister who can ride. This woman stood for us today. Now we stand for her." He ended the call and turned back to Rosie, who had listened to his half of the conversation with growing confusion and concern. "What are you doing?" Rosie asked. "Who was that?" Prophet's face softened into something that might have been a smile, though it carried too much weight to be called anything as simple as happiness. "Ms. Rosie," Prophet said, "you just became family. And in our world, family protects family. No matter what. No matter who comes after you. No matter what it costs." He placed his hand over his heart, the gesture carrying a solemnity that transcended words. "Tomorrow, you're going to understand exactly what that means." That night, Rosie couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed in the small house she had shared with Thomas before he died, the house where she had raised her daughters, the house filled with photographs of memories and ghosts that kept her company through the long hours of darkness. She kept hearing Holloway's voice, "You just made an enemy. This isn't over." She kept seeing the hatred in his eyes, the promise of retribution that no camera could fully capture. She kept calculating the ways he could hurt her, the inspections, the citations, the whispered words to other officials who owed him favors. She kept imagining her diner's doors closing for the last time, her employees without jobs, her granddaughter's scholarship suddenly insufficient to cover the costs of college without the supplemental income that Rosie had been quietly providing. Around 3 in the morning, Rosie got out of bed and walked to the living room. A photograph of Thomas sat on the mantel, the two of them on their wedding day in 1962, both so young, so full of hope for a future that would prove harder than they had imagined but more beautiful too. She picked up the photograph and held it in her trembling hands. "Did I do the right thing, baby?" she whispered to the image of her husband. "Or did I just destroy everything we built?" Thomas's smile in the photograph didn't answer her. But Rosie knew what he would have said if he had been there. He would have said that some things matter more than safety. He would have said that a life lived in fear isn't really living at all. He would have said that he was proud of her, that he had always been proud of her, that the woman he married would never have been able to watch injustice happen without standing up. Rosie set the photograph back on the mantel and returned to bed. Sleep didn't come, but something else did. A quiet peace, born from the knowledge that whatever happened next, she had done what was right. Whatever happened next, she could live with herself. And whatever happened next was going to begin in just a few hours, when the sun rose over Highway 58 and brought with it something that Rosie Jenkins could never have imagined, not in her wildest dreams, not in her most hopeful prayers. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of stillness that precedes something momentous. The sky over Bakersfield was clear and blue, already heating up toward another scorching day, and Rosie Jenkins moved through her opening routine with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed these same tasks thousands of times before. She unlocked the front door at 5:45, 15 minutes before the official opening time, because she had always believed that preparation was the foundation of success. She turned on the lights, watching the sunshine-yellow walls come alive with warm illumination. She started the coffee, the rich aroma filling the empty diner with the promise of a new day. She checked the coolers, inventoried the supplies, made notes about what needed to be ordered. She tried to pretend it was a normal day. It was not a normal day. Rosie's hands trembled as she wiped down the counter, the same counter where she had stood between a gun and a stranger less than 24 hours ago. She kept glancing at the door, expecting Holloway to walk through it at any moment with handcuffs or citations or whatever weapon he had chosen to deploy against her. Every car that passed on Highway 58 made her stomach clench. Every shadow that moved across the parking lot made her heart race. By 6:15, the first regular customers began to arrive. Old Jim Patterson, who had been eating breakfast at Rosie's place every weekday morning for 12 years, took his usual seat at the counter and ordered his usual eggs over easy with wheat toast and black coffee. Martha Chen, who ran the dry cleaning business 2 miles down the highway, stopped in for her morning muffin and orange juice. They both looked at Rosie with something new in their eyes, a mixture of concern and admiration that told her the story of yesterday's confrontation had already begun to spread. "Heard what happened," old Jim said, keeping his voice low even though there was no one nearby to overhear. "Heard you stood up to Holloway." "News travels fast," Rosie said, refilling his coffee cup with a steadiness she didn't feel. "News like that travels faster than fast," Jim replied. "Rosie, you need to be careful. That man doesn't forget. And he doesn't forgive." "I know what I did," Rosie said. "I know what might come of it. But I also know that I could live with the consequences of standing up. I couldn't live with the consequences of staying silent." Jim nodded slowly, respect deepening in his weathered features. "Thomas would be proud. You know that, right? Thomas would be real proud of the woman you've always been." Rosie felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. There was no time for crying. There was a diner to run, customers to serve, a life to continue living no matter what threats lurked on the horizon. At 6:25, Rosie heard the first rumble. She was in the kitchen, checking on the bacon that was sizzling in the pan, when the sound reached her ears. Distant at first, like thunder rolling across the desert, except the sky was clear and there was no storm in the forecast. She paused, spatula in hand, listening as the sound grew louder. And louder. And louder. Rosie set down the spatula and walked to the swinging door that separated the kitchen from the dining room. Through the front windows of the diner, she could see Highway 58 stretching into the distance, and on that highway, something was coming. Something that made the windows vibrate and the coffee cups rattle in their saucers. Motorcycles. Not 12 motorcycles, like yesterday. Not a dozen riders looking for a meal and some pie. This was something else entirely. This was a wave, a flood, a river of chrome and leather and rumbling engines that seemed to stretch to the horizon. They came from the east first, a column of Harley-Davidsons that filled the highway with their thunder. Then more appeared from the west, another column converging on the small roadside diner like metal filings drawn to a magnet. And from the north, down the side road that connected to the interstate, a third stream of motorcycles joined the others until the sound was overwhelming, until Rosie couldn't hear anything except the roar of hundreds of engines announcing their arrival. Rosie walked to the front window on legs that felt suddenly weak. Her hand rose to cover her mouth, and she realized that tears were streaming down her face, though she couldn't have said exactly when she had started crying. They filled her parking lot first. Then they lined Highway 58 in both directions, motorcycles parked along the shoulder as far as the eye could see. They spilled into the vacant lot across the street, chrome glinting in the morning sun, leather patches identifying chapters from cities Rosie had never visited, states she had never seen. Old Jim stood up from his counter stool and walked to the window, his coffee forgotten, his jaw hanging open in amazement. "Sweet mother of mercy," he breathed. "That's got to be 300 bikes. Maybe more." Martha Chen had her phone out, recording the scene, her muffin untouched on the plate in front of her. "This is incredible," she whispered. "This is absolutely incredible." The lead rider killed his engine and removed his helmet, and Rosie recognized Prophet Washington immediately. He had changed his shirt since yesterday, but he wore the same leather vest, the same patches, the same quiet dignity that had struck her from the moment he first walked into her diner. Prophet dismounted and walked toward the front door, followed by a river of bikers that seemed to have no end. The door opened, and Prophet stepped inside. Behind him came men and women of every race, every age, every background imaginable. Black and white and Latino and Asian, young and old, weathered and fresh-faced, all of them wearing their colors with pride, all of them looking at Rosie Jenkins with an expression she had never seen directed at herself before. They looked at her like she was a hero. "Ms. Rosie," Prophet said, his voice carrying the same gentle strength it had carried yesterday. "The angels take care of family. Yesterday, you became family." He smiled, and the expression transformed his face from something intimidating into something warm and welcoming. "We're here for breakfast. All of us." Rosie's laugh escaped before she could stop it, born from shock and disbelief and a joy so unexpected that she didn't know what else to do with it. "Baby, I've got 2 dozen eggs and half a pound of bacon. How in the world am I supposed to feed 300 people?" Prophet's smile widened. He gestured behind him, and Rosie saw that the bikers were carrying more than just their riding gear. They had crates of eggs stacked on their bikes, boxes of bread, coolers filled with bacon and sausage and ham, industrial-sized coffee makers that must have been borrowed from restaurant supply stores, bags of flour and sugar and everything else a diner might need to feed an army. "We brought provisions," Prophet said. "You just point us to the kitchen, and we'll take care of the rest." Within 30 minutes, Rosie's diner had transformed into something she could never have imagined. Bikers had taken over the kitchen, working with a coordination that suggested they had done this before. A massive Latino man named Hammer, who Rosie remembered from Prophet's phone call yesterday, manned the grill with surprising expertise. A woman named Snake, whose tattoos covered every visible inch of her arms, turned out to make the fluffiest pancakes Rosie had ever tasted. A young black man named Deuce washed dishes with military efficiency while debating music with a white biker twice his age. The dining room was packed beyond capacity. Bikers sat at every booth, every counter stool, every chair that could be carried in from outside. They spilled onto the patio that Rosie had never bothered to develop, sitting on overturned buckets and motorcycle seats that had been removed and repurposed as temporary furniture. They stood in groups in the parking lot, eating from paper plates, laughing and talking and creating a festival atmosphere that drew curious onlookers from the highway. And they kept coming. Every few minutes, another group of motorcycles would rumble into view, riders who had been farther away and taken longer to arrive, all of them drawn by the same call that Prophet had sent out yesterday. By noon, the count had passed 400, and Rosie had stopped trying to keep track. Prophet found her during a quiet moment, when she had stepped outside to catch her breath and process the overwhelming reality of what was happening around her. "You doing okay?" Prophet asked, leaning against the wall beside her. "I don't know what I'm doing," Rosie admitted. "I don't understand any of this. Yesterday, I thought I might lose everything. Today, I've got 400 bikers in my parking lot acting like I'm some kind of hero. It doesn't make sense." Prophet was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the crowd of bikers that filled every available space around Rosie's place. "Let me tell you something about myself," Prophet said finally. "Something that might help you understand why all these people are here." He reached into his vest and pulled out a worn photograph, creased and faded from years of being carried close to his heart. The photograph showed a young black man in military uniform, handsome and proud, standing in front of a helicopter in what was clearly a jungle environment. "That's me in 1967, Prophet said. Vietnam. I did 2 tours in that hellhole. Watched friends die in my arms. Took shrapnel that still sets off metal detectors. Earned a Purple Heart that I keep in a drawer because looking at it reminds me of things I'd rather forget. He put the photograph away, his eyes growing distant with memories. When I came home, I thought I'd be welcomed. I'd served my country, risked my life, watched brothers die for a flag that was supposed to represent freedom and equality and all those beautiful words they taught us in school. But you know what I found when I got back? Rosie shook her head, though she could guess. I found that my service didn't matter. I found that my medals didn't matter. I found that the color of my skin mattered more than the blood I'd spilled and the sacrifices I'd made. I couldn't get a job. Couldn't get an apartment in a decent neighborhood. Couldn't walk down the street without white folks crossing to the other side, looking at me like I was dangerous, like I was a threat, like I was anything other than a man who had given everything for a country that didn't want to give anything back. Prophet's voice hardened with old anger, the kind that never fully fades no matter how many years pass. So I found family where I could. I joined the Hells Angels in 1971, back when they were still mostly white, back when there were plenty of members who didn't want someone who looked like me wearing their colors. I had to fight for my place. Had to prove myself 10 times over. Had to be better, stronger, more loyal than anyone else just to be treated as an equal. He looked at Rosie, his eyes bright with emotion. But I also found brothers who didn't care about skin color. Found men who had served alongside black soldiers in Vietnam and knew that courage doesn't have a complexion. Found people who were willing to judge me by my character instead of my appearance. And together, we built something. We built the first fully integrated Hells Angels chapter in California. Prophet gestured at the crowd around them. Every person you see here knows my story. Knows what I fought for. Knows what I believe in. And when they heard what you did yesterday, when they heard that a black grandmother had put herself between a racist cop and a stranger just because it was the right thing to do, they didn't need to think twice about coming. Because what you did reminded them of why we were these patches in the first place. Why? Rosie asked softly. Because family protects family, Prophet said. Because loyalty means something. Because sometimes the world is cruel and unjust and the only way to survive is to find people who will stand with you when it matters. You stood for me yesterday, Ms. Rosie. You didn't know me. You didn't know me anything. But you stood anyway, because you believed it was right. Now everyone here is standing for you. Rosie felt tears threatening again, but this time she let them come. She had spent so many years being strong, being the one who held everything together, being the foundation that everyone else leaned on. She had forgotten what it felt like to be the one who was supported. I don't know what's going to happen next, Rosie said. Holloway isn't going to let this go. He'll find ways to come after me that all the bikers in the world can't prevent. Prophet nodded slowly. You're right. He will try. But you're not going to face him alone. We've already got lawyers on their way, people who specialize in police misconduct cases. We've got contacts in the media who are interested in telling your story. We've got people in this crowd who know how to document everything, how to build cases, how to shine light on the kind of darkness that men like Holloway depend on to survive. He placed his hand on Rosie's shoulder, the gesture carrying a weight of promise that transcended words. The Hells Angels aren't just a motorcycle club, Ms. Rosie. We're a network. We know people. We have resources. And we take care of our own. From this moment forward, you're one of us. Whatever comes next, you won't face it alone. By mid-afternoon, the media had arrived. News vans from 3 different stations lined the highway, their satellite dishes pointing toward the sky, their cameras capturing footage of the hundreds of motorcycles and the incredible scene unfolding at the small roadside diner. Reporters approached bikers for interviews, getting stories of loyalty and brotherhood and respect that challenged every stereotype they had ever absorbed about motorcycle clubs. The story that emerged was simple and powerful. A black grandmother had stood up to police harassment, and an unlikely army had gathered to stand with her. Black grandmother shields biker from police harassment, brotherhood responds with show of unity. The headline spread across regional news that evening. By the next morning, it had gone national. By the end of the week, Rosie Jenkins had become a symbol of something larger than herself, a reminder that courage could still triumph over intimidation, that community could still form in the most unexpected places. But the bikers didn't just bring cameras and attention. They brought practical support that would prove crucial in the days to come. A biker named Judge, who turned out to actually be a retired federal judge from Nevada, took Rosie aside and explained the legal protections she had against retaliation. A woman named Docs, who had been a nurse for 30 years before retiring to ride full-time, checked Rosie's blood pressure and gave her stern instructions about managing stress. A crew of younger bikers, supervised by a grizzled road captain named Torch, installed security cameras around the diner's perimeter, ensuring that any future confrontations would be documented from multiple angles. And through it all, the bikers kept coming. They ate breakfast and lunch and dinner. They bought pie by the dozen. They left tips that were double and triple the cost of their meals. They treated Rosie's staff with the same respect they showed Rosie herself, turning Keisha into a minor celebrity among the younger bikers and bringing shy smiles to the faces of the cooks who had never imagined that their work would feed such an unusual crowd. By Wednesday night, when the last of the bikers had finally departed and the parking lot fell quiet for the first time in hours, Rosie sat alone at her counter and tried to process everything that had happened. Her diner had been transformed. Not physically, though the security cameras were new, but spiritually. The sunshine yellow wall seemed brighter somehow. The hand-carved sign above the door seemed to carry more weight. The rule posted behind the register, "Respect given is respect earned," seemed to have been proven in ways that Rosie had never dared to imagine. She picked up Thomas's photograph from behind the register, where she had placed it that morning so he could see what was happening. "You would have loved this, baby," she whispered. "You would have loved every minute of it." The photograph didn't answer, but Rosie didn't need it to. She knew exactly what Thomas would have said. He would have said that this was what happened when you planted seeds of kindness and watered them with courage. He would have said that the harvest sometimes came in forms you never expected. Prophet had promised that this was just the beginning. He had promised that the legal pressure would continue, that the media attention would serve as protection, that the angels would keep coming back to show Holloway and anyone else who might threaten her that Rosie Jenkins was not alone. But what neither Prophet nor Rosie could have known was that the biggest twist was still coming. It would arrive 3 days later, wearing a business suit and carrying a briefcase full of documentation that would destroy Derek Holloway more completely than any amount of media attention or legal pressure ever could. It would arrive in the form of his own daughter. 3 days after the confrontation that had changed everything, Rosie's place was busier than it had ever been. The news coverage had drawn customers from counties away, people who wanted to see the famous diner where a grandmother had stood against injustice, where hundreds of bikers had gathered in solidarity, where something beautiful had grown from something ugly. Rosie had hired 2 new servers to handle the increased demand, both of them recommendations from Prophet who had backgrounds similar to the people Rosie had always chosen to employ. The kitchen staff worked double shifts. The pie baker started coming in at 4 in the morning instead of 6. Every day brought new faces, new stories, new people who wanted to shake Rosie's hand and tell her that what she had done mattered. And every Tuesday, without fail, Prophet and a rotating group of Hell's Angels arrived for lunch, their presence a visible reminder to anyone who might be watching that Rosie was under protection. It was a Saturday afternoon, the busiest day of the week, when the young black woman in the business suit walked through the door. She was in her late 20s, with natural hair pulled back in a professional style and eyes that carried a sharpness that suggested she didn't miss much. Her suit was expensive but not flashy, the kind of clothing worn by someone who wanted to be taken seriously without drawing unnecessary attention. She carried a leather briefcase that looked heavy with documents, and she moved through the crowded diner with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was there to accomplish. Rosie was refilling coffee cups at the counter when the woman approached. "Ms. Jenkins?" the woman asked. Her voice was professional, controlled, but there was something underneath it that Rosie couldn't quite identify. Something that sounded almost like nervous anticipation. "That's me," Rosie said, setting down the coffee pot. "What can I do for you?" "My name is Jasmine Holloway Pierce." The woman paused, watching Rosie's face for the reaction that she knew was coming. "I'm an attorney with the ACLU. And Derek Holloway is my father." The coffee pot slipped from Rosie's fingers, but she caught it before it could fall, her reflexes saving her from another shattered mess on the floor. "Holloway?" Rosie repeated, the name tasting like poison in her mouth. "As in the man who?" "As in the man who threatened you, harassed your customers, and nearly shot an unarmed civilian in your establishment," Jasmine finished. "Yes. That Derek Holloway. The same Derek Holloway who abandoned me and my mother when I was 5 years old because he couldn't handle having a biracial daughter." Rosie stared at the young woman, trying to reconcile the information she was receiving with everything she knew about Derek Holloway. The racist cop who had terrorized her diner had once been married to a black woman. Had fathered a black child. Had been someone entirely different from the monster he had become. Or perhaps not different at all. Perhaps just better at hiding it. "You'd better sit down," Rosie said finally. "I think we need to have a conversation." They moved to a booth in the corner, away from the noise and bustle of the lunch rush. Keisha brought water without being asked and discreetly positioned herself nearby, close enough to help if needed but far enough to give them privacy. "Tell me everything," Rosie said. Jasmine's story emerged in careful, measured sentences, the words of someone who had told this story before but never stopped feeling its weight. She had been born in 1975, the daughter of Derek Halloway and Michelle Robinson, a black woman who had met Derek when he was a young patrol officer with dreams of making a difference. In those early years, according to Michelle, Derek had been different. Idealistic. Determined to be one of the good cops, the kind who protected everyone equally, who saw past skin color to the humanity underneath. Michelle had believed in that version of Derek. She had married him despite her family's concerns, despite the stares they received when they walked down the street together, despite all the challenges that interracial couples faced in the 1970s. She had believed that love was enough to overcome any obstacle. She had been wrong. The change happened gradually, Jasmine explained. Derek started spending more time with certain officers on the force, men who held views that Michelle found troubling. He started making comments about black criminals, about the need for law and order, about the problems with certain communities. He started looking at Michelle differently, as if he was seeing her for the first time and didn't like what he saw. By the time Jasmine was 4, the marriage was falling apart. By the time she was 5, Derek had moved out. The divorce papers cited irreconcilable differences, but Michelle knew the truth. Derek had chosen his career, his colleagues, his new worldview over the family he had created. He had decided that having a black wife and a biracial daughter was incompatible with the man he was becoming. He didn't just leave, Jasmine said, her voice tight with old pain. He erased us. He told his new wife, his new family, everyone at the department, that his first marriage never happened. That I don't exist. He created a whole new history for himself, one where he had always been the person he is now instead of the person he used to pretend to be. Rosie listened in silence, her heart breaking for the child who had been abandoned by her own father, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of Derek Halloway's hypocrisy. The man who had snarled about serving animals had once promised to love and cherish a black woman. The man who had treated Prophet Washington like a criminal had fathered a daughter who carried both their bloodlines. "What happened to your mother?" Rosie asked. "She died 6 years ago," Jasmine said. "Cancer." She never stopped hoping that Derek would change, would realize what he had thrown away, would at least acknowledge my existence. She went to her grave disappointed. "I'm sorry," Rosie said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. "So am I," Jasmine replied. "But I didn't come here to share my sad story, Ms. Jenkins. I came here because I need your help." Jasmine opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder, setting it on the table between them. The folder was stuffed with documents, photographs, and what looked like official reports. "I've been documenting my father's abuses for 6 years," Jasmine said. "Ever since my mother died, and I decided that I wasn't going to let him destroy any more lives while pretending to be a good officer. I've collected complaints from citizens, testimony from witnesses, patterns of behavior that prove his racism isn't accidental but systematic." She spread some of the documents across the table. 47 formal complaints filed against him over the past 2 decades. Every single one dismissed or buried by internal affairs. 12 lawsuits settled quietly, with sealed records that the department paid to keep hidden. 3 shootings that were ruled justified despite evidence suggesting otherwise. Countless traffic stops targeting black drivers, arrests that don't hold up to scrutiny, injuries sustained by suspects during apprehension that were never properly investigated. Rosie looked at the documents, at the weight of evidence that represented years of abuse, years of victims, years of a system protecting one of its worst actors. "Why hasn't anyone done anything?" Rosie asked. "Because victims are afraid to testify," Jasmine said. "Because the department protects its own. Because the union fights any attempt at accountability. Because the people who have the power to make changes have decided that it's easier to look the other way." She leaned forward, her eyes meeting Rosie's with an intensity that made clear how much this moment meant to her. "But your video changed everything. Keisha's recording shows Derek harassing peaceful citizens, threatening a business owner, and reaching for his weapon without justification. Your testimony, combined with the testimony of 300 bikers who witnessed the aftermath, gives us something we've never had before. We have a case that the department can't bury. We have evidence they can't dismiss. We have public attention that makes cover-ups politically impossible." Jasmine's voice softened, the professional facade cracking slightly to reveal the wounded daughter underneath. "Ms. Jenkins, will you help me take him down?" Rosie was quiet for a long moment, considering the magnitude of what she was being asked. She thought about her diner, her employees, her granddaughter, all the people who depended on her, and all the ways that this fight could still go wrong. She thought about Halloway's threat, his promise to make her life difficult, his guarantee that this wasn't over. And she thought about Prophet's words. About Thomas's wisdom. About all the years she had spent building a sanctuary where everyone was family, where respect was earned and given freely, where injustice was not tolerated even when tolerance would have been safer. "What happens if we lose?" Rosie asked. Jasmine didn't flinch from the question. "He'll come after you with everything he has. He'll try to destroy your business, your reputation, everything you've built. He's done it to others who challenged him. He'll do it to you. And if we win? If we win, my father goes to prison. The department is forced to clean house. The victims get justice, or at least acknowledgement. And maybe, just maybe, the next Rosie Jenkins won't have to stand alone when she does the right thing." Rosie looked at the documents spread across the table. She looked at Jasmine, at the daughter who had been abandoned and erased and who had spent 6 years fighting for justice against her own father. She looked through the window at the sunshine yellow walls of her diner, at the customers enjoying their meals, at the life she had built through decades of work and sacrifice and stubborn refusal to let the world break her spirit. She thought about what Thomas would say. She already knew the answer. "I already made my choice when I stood between your father and Prophet," Rosie said finally. "Might as well finish what I started." The case that followed took 14 months. 14 months of depositions and hearings and legal maneuvering. 14 months of Holloway's lawyers trying to discredit witnesses, suppress evidence, and delay proceedings until the public attention faded. 14 months of the police union fighting every attempt at accountability while simultaneously claiming that they supported transparency and justice. But Rosie didn't face any of it alone. Prophet and the Hells Angels made good on their promise. Bikers attended every hearing, filling courtroom galleries with leather and patches and the visible reminder that Rosie had an army standing behind her. They rotated shifts so that someone was always watching, always present, always ready to document any attempt at intimidation or retaliation. The media stayed engaged, drawn by the drama of the story and the unusual alliance at its center. Jasmine proved to be a masterful public speaker, able to articulate the stakes of the case in ways that resonated with people who had never thought much about police accountability before. The combination of her personal story, her professional credentials, and her unwavering determination made her impossible to dismiss. And one by one, other victims began to come forward. The first was a black man named Marcus Thompson who had been arrested by Holloway 10 years earlier on drug charges that were later thrown out when it became clear the evidence had been planted. Marcus had been afraid to speak up before, convinced that no one would believe him against the word of a decorated officer. But watching Rosie's courage gave him courage of his own. After Marcus came a young Latino man named Jorge Mendez, who had been beaten during a traffic stop that Holloway had claimed was resisting arrest. Jorge had hospital records and witnesses who contradicted the official report, but his complaints had disappeared into the department's internal affairs black hole. Then came a black woman named Patricia Williams, whose teenage son had been shot by Holloway 5 years earlier in an encounter that was ruled justified despite multiple eyewitnesses claiming the boy had been unarmed and complying with orders when Holloway opened fire. Patricia had been fighting for justice ever since, and Jasmine's case gave her a platform she had never been able to access before. With each new witness, the case against Holloway grew stronger. With each new story of abuse, the pattern became more undeniable. The department's attempts to protect him became increasingly desperate, and the federal investigators who had taken an interest in the case became increasingly determined. The trial, when it finally came, was covered by national media. Cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom, but sketch artists captured the key moments, and reporters provided detailed accounts of testimony that revealed the full scope of Holloway's crimes. Rosie testified on the third day of the trial. She told the jury exactly what she had witnessed, exactly what Holloway had said, exactly how he had reached for his weapon with intent that was clear to everyone in the diner. She didn't embellish or dramatize. She didn't need to. The simple truth was damning enough. Prophet testified on the fourth day. His military decorations entered into evidence as a counter to any attempt to portray him as a criminal. He spoke about his service, his sacrifices, and the moment when a 67-year-old grandmother had put herself between him and a gun because she believed that injustice should never go unchallenged. Mills, Holloway's former partner, testified on the sixth day. He had been granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation, and he provided an insider's account of Holloway's behavior that corroborated everything the victims had claimed. He described racist comments made in private, evidence that had been falsified, reports that had been rewritten to justify unjustifiable actions. But the most powerful testimony came on the eighth day of the trial, when Jasmine Holloway Pierce took the stand to cross-examine her own father. Derek Holloway had aged during the 14 months of legal proceedings. His hair had gone grayer, his face had grown more lined, and the arrogance that had always defined him had been replaced by something closer to desperation. He sat in the witness chair in a suit that no longer fit quite right, facing a daughter he had abandoned and a courtroom filled with people who had finally seen him for what he truly was. Jasmine approached the witness stand with the calm focus of someone who had prepared for this moment for years. "Officer Holloway," she began, her voice professional despite the personal stakes, "you told Ms. Jenkins, and I quote, 'I'll decide what's legal.' Do you recall making that statement?" Holloway shifted in his seat, his eyes darting to his lawyer, who gave no indication of how to respond. "I was establishing authority in a tense situation," Holloway said. "That's standard procedure when dealing with potential threats." "A grandmother refilling coffee cups was a potential threat?" Jasmine asked. "Veterans eating pie were potential threats?" "The Hells Angels are a known criminal organization. I had every reason to be concerned." "You had no reason to harass law-abiding citizens who were peacefully eating lunch. But let's continue." Jasmine picked up a document from her table. "You also told Ms. Jenkins, you just made an enemy. This isn't over. Do you recall making that statement?" "I don't remember the exact words." The video recording, which has been entered into evidence, captured those exact words. "Would you like me to play it again for the jury?" Holloway's jaw tightened. "I may have said something along those lines." "Along those lines," Jasmine repeated. "Officer Holloway, would you describe threatening a business owner with retaliation as standard procedure?" "I wasn't threatening. I was warning her about the consequences of interfering with police business. Police business that involved harassing citizens without cause, demanding identification without suspicion of criminal activity, and reaching for your weapon when an unarmed man made no threatening movements whatsoever." Holloway's face reddened with the anger that had defined his entire career, the rage that he had directed at countless victims over 23 years. But in this courtroom, surrounded by cameras and witnesses and a daughter who refused to let him hide, that anger had nowhere to go. Jasmine continued, her voice never rising, her questions methodical and devastating. "You believed you could decide what's legal. You believed your badge made you untouchable. You believed that you could abuse your power without consequences because you had gotten away with it for 23 years. She paused, letting the silence stretch. "But here's what you never understood, Officer Holloway. The law doesn't belong to you. Justice doesn't answer to your hatred. And today, you're the one who's going to learn what's legal, and what you're going to pay for breaking it." The verdict came 3 days later. Guilty on all counts. Derek Holloway was found guilty of civil rights violations, abuse of power, filing false reports, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights. The federal charges carried mandatory minimum sentences that the judge had no discretion to reduce. The sentence was announced 2 weeks after the verdict. 20 years in federal prison. Stripped of his badge. Stripped of his pension. Required to pay restitution to his victims. The Bakersfield Police Department was placed under federal oversight, with a consent decree that required complete reform of their policies, training, and accountability mechanisms. 7 other officers were terminated or suspended pending investigation. The police union's leadership was replaced by reform-minded officials who promised to prioritize community relations over protection of bad actors. And Derek Holloway, who had spent 23 years believing that his badge made him untouchable, was led from the courtroom in handcuffs. Rosie was there to watch. So was Prophet. So was Keisha, who had grown from a nervous teenager into a young woman with a college scholarship funded partly by the settlement from her lawsuit against the department for intimidation she had faced after her video went public. And so was Jasmine Holloway Pierce, who watched her father being taken away and felt something that was too complicated to call satisfaction but too complete to call anything else. Was it worth it? Rosie asked her afterward, as they stood outside the courthouse surrounded by cameras and supporters and the chaotic energy of a major verdict. Jasmine considered the question carefully before answering. "He abandoned me when I was 5 years old because he couldn't accept having a daughter who looked like me. He spent the rest of his life pretending I didn't exist while hurting people who looked like me, who looked like my mother, who looked like you." She watched the van carrying her father disappear around a corner. "Justice doesn't undo the harm he caused. It doesn't bring back the years my mother spent hoping he would change. It doesn't heal the wounds of all the people he hurt. But it does something that matters. It says that what he did was wrong. It says that power doesn't protect you forever. It says that the people he victimized were human beings who deserved better." She turned to Rosie with eyes that held the weight of everything she had sacrificed to reach this moment. "So yes, Ms. Jenkins. It was worth it. Every bit of it." 1 year after Derek Holloway was led away in handcuffs, Rosie's place looked different but felt exactly the same. The diner had expanded. A new wing had been added to accommodate the crowds that now traveled from across the state to eat at the famous establishment where a grandmother had stood against injustice. The parking lot had been paved and enlarged, with designated spaces for motorcycles that were always occupied on Tuesdays. The kitchen had been upgraded with commercial equipment that could handle the increased demand without sacrificing the quality that had made Rosie's cooking legendary. But the walls were still sunshine yellow. The coffee was still strong and fresh. The chicken fried steak was still the best within 200 miles. And the rule behind the register remained unchanged: respect given is respect earned. No exceptions. There was a new sign above the door now, hand-carved like the original but with words that reflected everything that had happened. It read, "Rosie's place where everyone's family, and family protects family." The booth where Rosie had made her stand, where she had stepped between a gun and a stranger, now bore a small brass plaque that visitors often photographed. The plaque read, "On this spot, on July 11, 2000, Rosie Jenkins reminded us that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the refusal to let fear win." Keisha no longer worked as a waitress. She managed the diner now, having earned her business degree from the community college she had once nervously told the bikers about. The settlement from her lawsuit against the department had paid for her education, and the experience of standing up for what was right had shaped her into a leader that Rosie trusted completely. 3 former bikers worked in the kitchen, men who had found in Rosie's place the same sanctuary that so many others had discovered over the years. They had traded their riding schedules for cooking shifts, though they still wore their patches with pride during off hours. Jasmine Halloway Pierce visited monthly, always sitting at the counter, always ordering the peach cobbler that had become her favorite. She had been promoted at the ACLU and now led a division focused specifically on police accountability, using the precedent of her father's case to pursue justice in communities across the country. And every Tuesday, without fail, the rumble of motorcycles announced the arrival of Prophet Washington and whatever angels happened to be riding with him that week. On this particular Tuesday, 1 year to the day after Halloway's sentencing, Prophet walked through the door followed by a young biker who couldn't have been more than 22. The young man wore his patches nervously, still new enough to the club that he hadn't fully settled into the confidence that came with belonging. Rosie greeted Prophet with the hug that had become their ritual, then extended her hand to the newcomer. "Welcome to Rosie's place," she said. "First time here?" The young man nodded, looking around at the sunshine yellow walls and the photographs that now decorated them, images of the day 300 bikers had filled the parking lot, of the trial that had made national news, of the community that had formed around a single act of courage. "Prophet's told me the story 100 times, the young man said. "But being here, seeing it for real, it's different." Prophet guided the young biker to their usual booth, but before they sat, he turned to address the newcomer with the solemnity of someone passing down important wisdom. "You want to know what strength looks like?" Prophet asked, his voice carrying across the diner so that others could hear. "It's not the size of your engine or the miles you've ridden. It's not the fights you've won or the scars you carry. Strength is a 67-year-old grandmother stepping between a gun and a stranger because she decided that injustice wouldn't happen in her presence. That's strength. That's what we ride for. That's what these patches mean." The young biker looked at Rosie with new eyes, seeing not just an elderly woman running a diner but a warrior who had faced down evil and won. "How did you do it?" he asked. "How did you stand there when he had his hand on his gun?" Rosie considered the question, the same question she had been asked hundreds of times in the past year. Her answer had evolved over time, becoming clearer with each telling. "I was terrified," she admitted. "My hands were shaking so bad I could barely breathe. But fear isn't the enemy, baby. Fear is just information. It tells you that something matters, that something important is happening, that you need to pay attention. The question isn't whether you're afraid. The question is what you do while you're afraid." She looked around her diner, at the customers enjoying their meals, at the staff moving efficiently through their routines, at the life she had built through decades of work and sacrifice and love. "I could have stayed quiet. I could have let that officer do whatever he wanted and told myself it wasn't my business. That would have been safer. But there's no real safety in silence. There's no wisdom in letting wrong go unchallenged just because challenging it is dangerous. My husband Thomas used to say that the only thing evil needs to win is for good people to look the other way." She smiled, the expression carrying warmth and sorrow and hard-won wisdom. "I spent too many years looking the other way, telling myself that keeping my head down was the smart thing to do. But that day, something in me just said enough. Enough fear. Enough silence. Enough pretending that injustice happening to someone else isn't happening to all of us." The young biker nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "Prophet says you changed everything," he said. "That what happened here changed the whole department, changed how people think about standing up." "I didn't change anything by myself," Rosie said. "I just made a choice. Prophet made a choice to call for help. 300 bikers made a choice to show up. Jasmine made a choice to fight for justice even when it meant taking down her own father. Keisha made a choice to keep recording even when she was scared. All those witnesses made choices to testify even when it was risky. She placed her hand over her heart. Change doesn't come from one person being a hero. Change comes from a whole lot of people deciding, one by one, that they're done being silent. That they're done looking the other way. That they're going to stand up even when standing up is hard. That evening, after the last customers had left and the staff had gone home, Rosie sat alone at the counter in the quiet of her empty diner. The lights were dimmed, casting soft shadows across the sunshine-yellow walls. The smell of coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the memory of all the meals that had been served, all the conversations that had been shared, all the lives that had intersected within these walls. She picked up the photograph of Thomas that she kept behind the register. In it, they were both young, standing in front of the rundown building that would become Rosie's place, their faces bright with hope and determination. "We did good, baby," she whispered to the image. "We built something that mattered. Something that lasted. Something that grew into more than we ever imagined." She set the photograph back in its place and looked around at the diner she had scrubbed and painted and filled with love for 35 years now. The diner that had become a sanctuary. The diner that had witnessed an act of courage that rippled outward until it changed an entire community. Tomorrow, she would open at 6 like always. She would serve coffee and breakfast and her famous peach cobbler. She would welcome strangers and regulars alike, treating everyone with the respect that she expected in return. She would continue building the sanctuary that Thomas had dreamed of, the family that kept growing with every person who walked through the door. And when the world threw injustice at her doorstep, she would stand up. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because some things mattered more than fear. Not because she was special, but because she had learned that ordinary people doing the right thing was the only way that anything ever changed. The brass plaque in the booth caught the dim light, its words glinting in the shadows. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the refusal to let fear win." Rosie smiled, turned off the lights, and locked the door behind her. Outside, the stars were bright over Highway 58. The air was cool and clear, carrying the distant sound of trucks passing in the night. Somewhere out there, people were making choices. Some would choose silence. Some would choose to look the other way. But some, inspired by a story they had heard about a grandmother and a diner and 300 bikers who showed up when it mattered, would choose courage. And that was enough. That was always enough. What goes around comes around. No one is above justice. And sometimes the strongest shield isn't leather or metal or a badge. Sometimes the strongest shield is the unwavering spine of someone who simply refuses to let injustice win. Now I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Rosie's situation? Do you think Holloway's punishment was fair, or should it have been more? What part of this story moved you the most? Drop your answers in the comments below. I read every single one, and your perspectives matter to me. If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Black Lives Stories brings you new content every week, stories of karma, courage, and the moments when evil meets its match. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with someone who might be facing their own moment of choice, their own opportunity to stand up instead of staying silent. Because stories like Rosie's don't just entertain. They remind us who we can be when we stop looking the other way. Until next time, remember this: you never know when your moment will come. You never know when you'll be faced with the choice between silence and courage, between safety and justice, between looking away and standing up. But when that moment comes, remember Rosie Jenkins. Remember a grandmother with shaking hands and a steel spine. Remember that one person's choice to do the right thing can change everything. Family protects family. Respect given is respect earned. And courage, true courage, is simply refusing to let fear have the final word.